There's a lighthouse that's never been lit. Locals avoid it. Tourists don't talk about it. And thrill-seeker Damien Cross, he couldn't resist it. But when he stepped inside the unlit tower, he didn't find an empty ruin. He found a mirror that showed something impossible. Dead versions of himself. Twisted, drowned, burned. The tower doesn't just keep secrets, it collects them. And what watches from the other side of that mirror isn't human. It's older than the sea, and hungrier than death. You don't visit the tower, you become part of it. There's something about the sea that draws lost people to it. Drifters, dreamers, ghosts. For Damien Cross, it was the unlit tower. Perched like a rotting tooth on a jagged rock just off Carver's Bay, the lighthouse had never once shined its light. Locals whispered that it was cursed, built wrong, abandoned since the last keeper vanished without a trace. But for Damien, a thrill-chasing urban explorer with a taste for the forbidden, it was a challenge too good to pass up. What he found inside was not graffiti, not history, not silence. He found a mirror. Not a mirror in the usual sense. This one didn't reflect you. It reflected versions of you. Broken ones. Twisted ones. Damien stared into the glass and saw himself dead in 100 ways. Every death different. Every Damien trapped. And then came the voice. Not from the mirror, but from the tower itself. A whisper older than language. An ancient sea god, using the tower as a lure, pulling in the curious, the cocky, the doomed. In the end, the mirror didn't show Damien his reflection. It showed his fate. And when the next curious soul climbs the tower, they'll see Damien, standing inside that mirror, watching, waiting. Not every lighthouse is meant to guide you home. Some are meant to keep you lost. Story number 1. Elliot Granger had never believed in the supernatural. In the years since he'd left the Navy, the only thing he'd trusted was the steady rhythm of the sea and the glow of his lighthouse. The isolated stretch of rock he called home, a craggy outcrop off the coast of Scotland, wasn't much, barely more than a lonely point in the ocean. But it was his, and that was all he needed. His only company was the salt-stained walls of the lighthouse and the occasional letter from Isla, the local historian, who wrote to ask if he'd found anything interesting during his long, quiet nights. Elliot never responded, but he always read her letters. The words a fleeting reminder of a life he no longer lived. It started one night, a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, tugging at the edges of the structure. But the more he listened, the more he could hear. It was faint, like a voice barely audible above the howling storm. He'd been sitting in the keeper's quarters watching the beam of light sweep over the waves when it came again. A soft murmur. His heart beat faster, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The storm raged outside, but it wasn't the weather that unsettled him. It was the voice. He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the endless blackness of the ocean. But the whispering persisted. No, not just whispering. It was a call. Elliot. He shuddered and stepped away from the glass. This wasn't normal. The lighthouse had always been a silent sentinel in the night. The beam swept across the sea, a steady, unwavering light that guided ships safely to shore. But the ships weren't safe. Not anymore. The first wreck had happened 3 nights ago. A freighter, caught in the storm, had crashed against the jagged rocks. Elliot had watched it from the safety of his tower, helpless as the ship broke apart, its crew lost to the depths. He'd felt nothing at the time, Not for the lives lost, not for the sailors screaming out into the storm, but now, the whispering. It gnawed at him. Elliot's nights grew darker after that. Each evening, as the light flickered on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could no longer ignore them. They seemed to be coming from the light itself, as if the beam had developed a voice of its own. Each word, each breath, felt like a weight on his chest. Feed us. That was the worst part. The voice seemed to hunger, as if it needed something, someone. And it wasn't long before the second shipwreck happened. A small cargo vessel. Another life lost. Another body claimed by the sea. Jonah, a grizzled old ship captain who frequented the nearby docks, came to him one night, his face pale and drawn. He'd nearly been taken by the light. "Your light?" Jonah muttered, eyes wild. It speaks. It's cursed. There's something wrong with it. I nearly crashed into the rocks tonight, but something pulled me away at the last second. The beam, it spoke to me." Elliot was silent, staring at the flickering flame. Inside the lantern, the same light that had been passed down for centuries. He knew Jonah wasn't mad. He'd felt it too. The growing pull, the steady hum that vibrated in his bones. The whispers weren't just in his mind. They were real. Elliot visited Isla the next day. She had always known the island's secrets, its history. Maybe she could help him understand what was happening. "The light has always been here, Elliot," she said, her voice trembling with something more than fear. "But it's more than just a lighthouse. There are stories, ancient stories. You see, the lighthouse sits on a foundation older than the stone it's built from. The first keeper was a man named Malcolm, and the island, it was a place of sacrifice. Sailors, lost at sea, were drawn here, brought to the rocks by the light. They say it feeds on their souls." Elliot's blood ran cold. It couldn't be true. Could it? "You think it's alive?" he asked. Isla nodded. "It's the light that whispers. It lures ships in. It takes their souls, and in return, it continues to shine. The lighthouse needs them, needs the souls to keep the beam burning." Elliot stood, a chill settling in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He had to leave, to escape the pull of the light. But as he turned to walk away, he felt a tremor beneath his feet. The ground beneath the lighthouse shook, and for the first time, he could hear the voices more clearly than ever. "Elliot," they called, louder now. "Elliot, you will join us." He didn't run. He couldn't. The whispering was inside him now, in his mind, in his heart. His legs felt heavy as he returned to the lighthouse, the beam cutting through the fog like a blade. Jonah had been right. The light wanted something from him. The truth settled in his bones. He wasn't the keeper of the lighthouse. He was a prisoner. The light had chosen him, just as it had chosen the others before him. That night, as the storm raged around the lighthouse, the beam shone, brighter than ever before. Elliot stood before it, staring into the endless abyss of the ocean. He could hear the whispers now, could feel them, tugging at his very soul. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he stepped into the beam. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the whispers erupted into a chorus of voices, echoing through the lighthouse like 100 souls screaming in unison. And as the light enveloped him, Elliot Granger vanished, his voice joining the others. His soul became one with the beam, and he too became part of the eternal whispering. The next morning, Isla found his journal by the lighthouse, the last entry scrawled hastily in trembling ink. "I hear them, Isla. The light. it calls. I am becoming part of it. I don't know how much longer I have. The ships kept coming, and the lighthouse kept shining. Its beam ever hungry, its whispers echoing across the waves, waiting for the next lost soul to feed its insatiable hunger. Story number 2. Lena Voss had always believed in science, in facts, in the things you could touch and see. But after her sudden decision to leave her career as a marine biologist, she found herself standing at the edge of something that didn't make sense, something that didn't belong to her rational world. Point Delirium. The name alone had set her on edge when she first received the job offer. The station was located on a jagged cliff along a desolate stretch of coast in northern Maine, a place no one visited unless they had to. And yet, she found herself there, stepping out of the truck and onto the salt-crusted pier, her boots sinking slightly into the wet wood. The lighthouse was old, almost as ancient as the waves that pounded against the rocks below. Its weathered brick walls looked like they'd been carved from the very cliffs they stood on. And, of course, there was the light itself. 13 lamps in total, each positioned in a circle around the towering structure. All of them functional, except for the 13th one. Old May, the local woman who lived in a ramshackle house a few miles away, had warned her the day before, in that cracked, raspy voice of hers, "Don't you ever touch it, girl. That 13th lamp, it's a curse. Something trapped inside it waiting to be freed. You light that lamp, and you'll bring them back." Lena had smiled politely, even though the hair on the back of her neck prickled. May was eccentric, to say the least, a relic of the past who had lived through things Lena didn't care to hear about. She had no time for ghost stories or warnings wrapped in old wives' tales. The first few days at Point Delirium were uneventful. The routine was simple. Check the light, record the weather, clean the lens, and watch the sea crash against the rocks. Her only contact was Captain Ross, a voice on the radio who had been maintaining the station's operations from the mainland. But it was the 13th lamp that gnawed at her curiosity. Every time she climbed the winding stairs to check the lamps, her eyes were drawn to it. The empty, unlit socket in the center of the circle. The others were bright, their beams cutting through the fog and the rain. But the 13th one was dark, silent. Lena didn't believe in superstition. It was just a lamp, a mechanical thing, nothing to be afraid of. And that night, as the storm raged outside, she decided to do something she knew she shouldn't. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the cold brass of the 13th lamp's switch. She hesitated for a moment, the strange warning from old May echoing in her mind. But it was too late. Her curiosity had already made up its mind. With a sharp click, the lamp flickered to life. The room around her seemed to shift. The air grew, thick with an unnatural cold, and the sound of the waves, once rhythmic and comforting, became distorted, like something was dragging its way up from the depths. Lena staggered back, her heart pounding, and then she heard it. The whisper. It was faint at first, just a low hum, but it grew louder, closer, insistent. The air inside the tower seemed to warp, like the fabric of reality itself was tearing apart. The light of the 13th lamp pulsed, and something began to form in its glow. A shape, a vessel, a ship. Lena's eyes widened in horror. The ship appeared to be made of fog and shadow, its sails tattered and stained as if it had been lost for centuries. A phantom ship, its hull carved from the dark sky itself. She could hear the distant creak of wood and the snap of ropes, but it wasn't the sound of a ship sailing on the ocean. It was the sound of something trapped, something struggling to be free. And then she saw him. The phantom captain. A tall figure standing at the helm, his face hidden beneath the brim of his captain's hat. His eyes glowed with a cold, ghostly light as he turned to look at her. Lena froze, her breath caught in her throat. She could see now. His hands were skeletal, his uniform shredded like it had been worn for an eternity. The ship, the captain, they were all trapped between dimensions, a prisoner of the 13th lamp, and they needed her. You lit the flame. The phantom captain's voice boomed, low and unsettling, like it came from the depths of the ocean itself. Now you must sail with us. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the ship's mast seemed to sway as though beckoning her. The light of the 13th lamp pulsed faster now, and the shadows stretched toward her like long fingers, tugging at her, pulling her. Lena Voss, the captain said again, his voice now closer, almost in her ear. You will be our navigator. You will guide us out of this prison. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. The lamp's light grew brighter, filling her vision until it was all she could see. The whispers became screams, the cries of those lost at sea, the souls trapped in this spectral ship. Suddenly, the floor beneath her shifted, and the room seemed to disappear. Lena was no longer standing in the lighthouse. She was on the deck of the phantom ship, the wind howling around her, the ghostly crew moving in slow, eerie motions. The ship groaned beneath her feet, its sails billowing, though there was no wind. The phantom captain stood before her, silent, waiting. Lena tried to speak, to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The ship's deck creaked and moaned, the ghostly figure of the captain towering over her. You are bound to us now, the captain's voice echoed. You will sail the seas, forever. Lena's eyes snapped open. She was back in the lighthouse. The 13th lamp was still glowing, its light steady, its warmth fading. But when she looked outside, the sea had changed. The waves were calm, unnaturally so, and the sky had taken on an eerie, otherworldly glow. A ship appeared in the distance. No ordinary ship, but a ghostly vessel, its sails full and its shadow stretching across the sea. Lena Voss didn't know how much time had passed, but she knew one thing. She would never leave the lighthouse. She would never escape the 13th flame, and the ship that called to her would always be there, waiting for her to take her place at the helm. The storm raged outside, but inside the tower there was only silence and the whisper of the ship's captain. Welcome aboard, navigator. Story number 3. The lighthouse was supposed to be a place of solitude, a place where Jack Meyer could finally escape. The city had worn him thin. Too many years in the newsroom, chasing stories that left him hollow, too many faces that never smiled back. A life of lies and headlines had driven him to seek peace, and that's what he thought he'd find at Black Reef Lighthouse. It wasn't much. The lighthouse towered over jagged cliffs, isolated on a narrow strip of land where the sea seemed to beat against the rocks with an unrelenting fury. The air was thick with salt and fog, a constant presence that kept the world muted, as though it were wrapped in a blanket too tight for comfort. Jack had expected the isolation. He welcomed it even. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: the fog. It started innocently enough. A cool mist that would roll in from the sea every evening, blanketing the land and swallowing everything in its path. But it wasn't the fog itself that made Jack uneasy. It was what moved within it. The figures. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of his lantern, the shadows flickering unnaturally in the mist. But then he began to document it. Every night, the same thing. Figures, tall, hunched shapes, would pass by the lighthouse, shrouded in the fog, their forms barely visible through the mist. They never spoke. They never moved like normal people. There was something wrong about the way they moved. Something unnatural. At first, Jack tried to dismiss it. Rationality had always been his anchor, the thing that kept him grounded in his darkest moments. But each night the figures became more defined, their presence more disturbing. It wasn't until the first storm rolled in that things began to change. A shipwreck. It came out of nowhere, a dark shape through the fog, scraping against the rocks below. Jack barely had time to react. He rushed down to the beach, the wind howling around him, the sound of the ship breaking apart echoing in his ears. There was a body. Just one. A woman, half-conscious, her face pale, lips cracked and eyes wide with terror. Jack did what he was trained to do. He pulled her from the water, brought her into the lighthouse and wrapped her in blankets. She was delirious, her breaths shallow, her eyes darting around like she was looking for something, or someone. "You're safe now," Jack said, trying to soothe her, but she didn't seem to hear him. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "The fog. The fog hides them. The Taken," she muttered. They walk in the mist. I saw them. I saw them take everyone." Jack frowned, his rational mind kicking in. He had heard stories. Of course, ghost stories and tall tales about lighthouses on isolated shores. But there was something about her face, something terrified that made him pause. "The fog is alive," she whispered again, more urgently. "It's not just fog. It's a prison. It traps you. It takes everything from you. You won't remember, at least not at first." Jack didn't know what to make of it. She seemed like a survivor, shell-shocked, probably suffering from the trauma of the wreck. But there was something unsettling about her story, something that tickled at the back of his mind. The next night the fog came again. It was heavier this time, thicker, almost like it had weight, and the figures, they were there again, moving through the mist. But tonight, Jack wasn't alone. Celeste, the shipwreck survivor, was sitting. In the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the fog outside the window, her hands shaking. She was staring at the figures. He could tell because her face was pale, her mouth trembling as she watched them. "Do you see them?" she asked, voice strained. "They're coming for us. They'll come for you too. They take everything. The memories, the soul. They're not human." Jack felt a chill settle in his chest, but he couldn't afford to believe in it. Not yet. Rationality. Always. The next morning, Celeste was gone. He found her tracks leading to the edge of the cliff, but there was no sign of her after that. Just the endless, swirling fog below. She had vanished. Just like that. No scream, no struggle. Just the fog. Jack felt a creeping unease crawl up his spine. He sent a letter to his brother, Henry, on the mainland, detailing what had happened. Henry, a practical man, would know what to do. But the letter came back unopened. A strange thing, really. Henry had always been good about responding. Always so. Jack wrote another. And another. But still, no reply. Days turned into weeks, and the fog kept coming. It seemed to grow thicker each time, a creeping darkness that rolled in, engulfing everything in its path. The figures, too, became bolder, more visible. They weren't just walking through the mist anymore. They were approaching the lighthouse, their silhouettes pressing against the glass, their hollow eyes staring through the windows. Then, one night, as Jack sat by the fire, reading the journal of his predecessor, he found a passage that chilled him to the bone. The fog is not a thing of nature. It is ancient, it is alive, and it feeds on memory. It feeds on the soul. It takes you, piece by piece, until you become nothing more than a ghost in its mist. The taken are not dead. They are lost, like the rest of us. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His eyes flickered to the window. The figures had gathered outside again, closer now, too close. They weren't just moving anymore. They were waiting. And then he understood. The fog wasn't a curse. It was a creature, ancient and hungry, a thing that fed on memory and life itself. And now it had set its sights on him. The wind howled louder. The door to the lighthouse groaned, rattling as if something was pushing against it. The fog pressed, in like a living thing, as if it were trying to get inside. Jack grabbed his journal, scrawling his final entry. It's coming for me. The fog. The figures. It's not just fog. It's alive. If anyone reads this, know that I'm not the first. I won't be the last. The taken are real. The fog takes you when you least expect it, and there's no escaping it. The door burst open with a deafening crack, and then, just as the figures reached the threshold, Jack vanished into the fog. His journal was found days later, left behind on the desk, the ink still wet on the final page. But Jack Meyer was never seen again. The fog, however, kept rolling. In every night, thick and relentless, a living nightmare. And it always waited, patiently, for the next soul to wander into its depths. Story number 4. The lighthouse at Edgewater Point stood tall and crumbling, a relic from another time. For years it had been abandoned, its light extinguished, its purpose long forgotten. But Thomas Crane, Thomas, the last keeper, refused to leave. He had been stationed there long before the Navy had let him go, before they told him he was too old, too rigid, too set in his ways. So he ended up here, on this rocky outcrop by the sea, keeping watch over a lighthouse that no longer served a purpose. The place wasn't even his anymore. The government had decommissioned it years ago. The structure was falling apart, the paint peeling from the walls, the wind howling through cracks in the windows. But Thomas stayed. It wasn't the loneliness that kept him there. It was the guilt, the shipwreck. It had happened 2 years ago, on a night just like this. Thomas had been in the tower, eyes trained on the sea when the storm rolled in. The ship had come in too fast, its lights barely visible through the downpour. The fog had swallowed it whole before he could react, before he could flash the warning. By the time he rang the bell, it was too late. The ship crashed against the rocks, breaking apart in the violent waves, and Thomas could do nothing but watch. He couldn't save them. The crew, the passengers, they drowned in the sea. Now, every night he relived that night. Every night the storm returned. The ship came in too fast, and he failed again and again. It was always the same. The hopelessness, the scream of the ship's horns, the pounding of the waves. But tonight was different. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing the cliffs and the lighthouse. Thomas stood at the window of the keeper's quarters, staring out into the mist, his hand resting on the cold metal of the lamp. It was supposed to be off. It was supposed to be a dead station. But the light flickered. Just for a second. A flash of memory, Or something else? The storm came again, the same as always. The ship, the wreck, the cries of those trapped beneath, the waves. And yet, this time, Thomas heard something new. Footsteps, not from the storm, not from the ship, from the shore. Thomas turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. But no one was there. No one could be there. The only things left on this forgotten spit of land were the ghosts of the drowned. He thought he heard the sound of someone whispering, low and insistent. A voice he didn't recognize, but somehow he knew. Help us. His breath hitched. He rushed to the door and pulled it open, stepping out into the cold night. The wind bit at his skin, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a deafening roar. The lighthouse's beam swept across the water, illuminating the shore for a brief moment. And that's when he saw them. The crew, a dozen men, soaked and gaunt, their eyes hollow and empty. They staggered through the fog, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were walking in water. Their faces were pale and covered in seaweed, their uniforms tattered from the storm. The captain stood at the front, his face grim, his eyes locked on Thomas. "Captain Hal?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The figure in the front nodded. The man was familiar. He was the captain of the ship that sank that fateful night. Thomas could see it in the man's eyes. A hunger, a need. "You failed us." The captain's voice was low, like the sound of waves crashing against the shore. "You didn't save us. You let us die." Thomas staggered backward, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. They weren't real, he told himself. They couldn't be. But the smell of salt water, the cold dampness that clung to them, it was too real. "You let us drown," Captain Hal repeated, his voice echoing in the fog. "Now, we want justice." Thomas couldn't breathe. His knees buckled and he sank to the ground. The memories of that night hit him all at once. How the ship had lurched in the storm. How he'd screamed into the wind to warn them. But they couldn't hear him. They hadn't heard him. "I tried," Thomas whispered. "I tried to save you." "Not hard enough," the captain said, stepping closer. His form seemed to flicker like a mirage before solidifying again. The other men followed, their hollow eyes trained on Thomas. The ground beneath Thomas seemed to shift, and suddenly he was back at the lighthouse, looking out over the water, the storm raging again. He knew what was coming. He had lived this moment hundreds of times. But this time, something was different. This time, it wasn't just the shipwreck. The fog was thickening, turning black. The men weren't disappearing like they always did. They were staying. They were walking closer. "Help us," Captain Hal said again, his voice a growl now. "Help us, and you can go free. Save us. Save your soul." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. He knew he had failed them. He had failed them all. The storm had taken them, and now they were taking him. This time, there would be no escape. He had been stuck in this loop for so long. Every night, the shipwreck, the crash, his death. But now, it wasn't just a memory. It was real. The drowned sailors were real. The fog crept closer, the figures surrounding him. Thomas could feel them, their cold hands brushing against his skin. He heard their voices, soft at first, then louder, demanding, "Save us, Thomas. You can't run anymore." Thomas stood up, his body trembling. He had no fight left in him, no escape. The guilt, the failure, it had all built up to this moment. There was no way out. With a final, broken sigh, he stepped forward into the mist. The captain's hand reached out, and Thomas allowed it to pull him into the cold, salty sea. And in that moment, as the fog closed in around him, Thomas Crane knew that he wasn't just dead, he was lost. One of the taken. Forever. The lighthouse, abandoned once more, stood silent and still, and the fog rolled in, thicker than ever, as it waited for its next victim. Story number 5. Riley Hart wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She was a techie, an independent thinker, someone who preferred to rely on facts and gadgets rather than superstitions. So, when she was assigned to renovate the old signal room of the Blackstone Lighthouse, she expected nothing more than a few dusty wires and outdated equipment to fix. It would be just another job, and Riley didn't get spooked easily. The lighthouse itself was a lonely place, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the turbulent sea. It had been decommissioned years ago, left to decay with the passing of time. The lighthouse keeper, a woman named Meg, had disappeared in the 1960s, and since then, the place had sat empty, its light extinguished. But someone had to fix it up, and that someone was Riley. When she first arrived, the signal room looked like a relic of the past. Dusty desks, tangled cables, and an old radio set in the corner. She immediately got to work, starting with the basics, rewiring the old equipment, cleaning up the space, and making sure everything was functional. She had no idea what she was getting into. By the third night, something strange began to happen. Riley was working late, the sound of rain and wind battering the lighthouse as she tinkered with the old radio. She'd already replaced some of the broken parts, and now it was time to test it. She tuned it to various frequencies, listening to the static, when she heard something faint, almost imperceptible. Morse code. At first, Riley thought it was just interference, but as she listened more closely, she realized it wasn't random static. The code was deliberate, a message being sent in long, steady bursts. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down the dots and dashes, decoding it in her head. The message sent a chill down her spine. Help me, help me, help me. It wasn't just any message. It was a distress signal, and it was coming from the lighthouse itself. Riley was skeptical. Ghosts? Time loops? None of it made sense. The signal was probably coming from a malfunction in the equipment. But the more she listened, the more persistent the message became. Every night, at the same time, the same signal, looping over and over again, like someone or something was trying to reach out to her. On the fourth night, Riley decided to investigate further. She went down to the radio room, trying to trace the signal's source. Oscar, the radio operator from the nearby town, had been helping her with some of the more technical issues. He'd been working in the area for years and knew the history of the lighthouse well. Anything unusual? Oscar asked as he looked over her shoulder at the radio's display. Riley hesitated. There's a distress signal. I think it's coming from here, from the lighthouse. Oscar raised an eyebrow. That's impossible. The lighthouse was decommissioned years ago. There's no way anyone's sending signals from here. I don't know, Riley said, her voice tinged with doubt. But the code is clear. Someone, or something, is trying to contact us. Oscar frowned. Maybe it's just old equipment. You know how things get around here. But Riley wasn't convinced. That night she stayed in the signal room, determined to get to the bottom of it. She watched the radio, waiting for the code to start again. It came at precisely midnight, like clockwork. Help me, help me, Help me." Riley scrambled to decode the message, but this time it was different. There was a new part to it, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's me." She froze. The words didn't make sense. Who was me? And then it hit her. She had been hearing that same message for the past few nights, each time feeling more and more desperate, like someone, or something, was trapped. But the message hadn't changed. This time, though, it was clear. The signal wasn't just a call for help, it was a warning. She quickly grabbed her journal, flipping through the pages, trying to make sense of everything. That was when she found it. The name she had written in her notes earlier when she had been digging through the lighthouse's history. Meg, the former keeper. Meg had vanished in the 1960s, just like the others who had worked here. There was no trace of her. No body, no record, just a name in old files. But now, Riley was starting to wonder if Meg had never really left at all. She sat back in her chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. Suddenly, a thought struck her. What if the signal wasn't coming from the past? What if the time here was distorted? What if the lighthouse was somehow stuck in a loop that was repeating the same events over and over again? What if the signal wasn't just a distress call, but a warning that she was the one trapped now? And that's when it happened. The lights flickered. The room felt cold, and the radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't the Morse code. A voice. Riley. It was a voice she didn't recognize. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. It was her name, being called from the radio. "Who is this?" Riley whispered, her heart racing. "What do you want?" the voice responded. It wasn't clear, but Riley could make out fragments. "I'm here. I'm stuck. Just like you." Riley's breath caught in her throat. She reached for the radio, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the dials. The voice continued to crackle through the static. "I didn't leave. I didn't escape." And then the signal stopped. The radio fell silent, and Riley sat in the dark, her thoughts spinning. The clock ticked, and the night passed as if nothing had happened. She looked at the radio again, but it was silent now. The distress signal, the voice, everything was gone. She checked her watch. It was midnight, and that's when it dawned on her. The lighthouse, the signal, the message. It wasn't just an anomaly, it was a loop, a cycle that kept resetting. Meg had been trapped here, stuck in time, just like the others before her. And now Riley was part of it too. The next night, the same thing happened. The signal came again at midnight, and Riley felt herself drawn back to the radio like a moth to the flame. But this time, she didn't fight it. She couldn't. She had seen the truth. She was fated to die here, to become part of the cycle. And just as the clock struck midnight, the signal filled the air once more. Riley's voice broke through the static as she spoke the words she'd been hearing all along. "Help me." But no one would answer. In the final moment, Riley's voice faded into nothingness, swallowed by the static. The signal room was silent once again, and the lighthouse stood watching, waiting for the next loop to begin. Story number 6. Harold Bain had been the keeper of the lighthouse at Grayson's Point for nearly 15 years. A solitary man whose only company was the ocean breeze and the sound of waves crashing against jagged rocks. The lighthouse was his inheritance, a legacy passed down through generations of keepers. His great-grandfather had built it. His grandfather had maintained it. And now, it was his turn. But lately, something had been off. It started with the bones. At first, Harold thought it was just his imagination. After all, the lantern chamber, high above the ground, had always been a place of solitude and dust. But every night, as he made his rounds through the tower, something strange began to appear. Small fragments of bone, hidden behind the metal beams, buried in the crevices of the tower's old walls. He would sweep them away, brush them under the rug, dismissing them as the remains of some long-forgotten animal. But over time, the fragments became larger, more distinct. They weren't animal bones at all. They were human. The first time Harold found an entire hand, curled and skeletal, wedged into the corner of the lantern chamber, his heart stopped. The fingers were long, unnaturally thin, and covered in a layer of salt and grime from years of exposure to the sea. He tried to ignore it. Maybe it was some sort of joke, an old fisherman's prank, or perhaps an oddity from the storms that battered the cliffs. But the feeling of dread began to grow with each passing day. The bones were piling up. It wasn't just one or two scattered pieces. It was whole limbs, entire ribs, skulls. Each night, Harold walked the tower's winding stairs with a heavy heart, knowing what he'd find. The bones were always there, silently waiting, creeping out of hidden spaces, drawing closer and closer to the lantern chamber itself. Then came the voices. It was subtle at first, just a faint whisper that couldn't quite be placed. Harold chalked it up to the wind, the old creaking of the lighthouse's bones. But then, one night as he stood at the lantern chamber window cleaning the glass, he heard it clearly. "Leave us." He froze. The voice was soft, like the sigh of the sea, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It was human. Harold turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the chamber. The light from the lantern cast long shadows, but there was nothing. Just the bones. Just the bones, which seemed to have grown in number since the night before. Something was wrong. Something ancient and terrible was waking. He tried to explain it to himself. The bones were probably part of a shipwreck from long ago, washed ashore and left behind. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. This was something more. This was deliberate. The following day, Harold went into town to see Dr. Keene, the local archaeologist. The man had worked on many digs in the area, and Harold thought he might have some insight into the strange discoveries. Dr. Keene listened patiently as Harold recounted the events. His brow furrowed as Harold spoke about the bones, the voices, and the strange feeling that the lighthouse had become something alive. "You say the bones are old," Dr. Keene said slowly, rubbing his chin. "But there's something strange about them, isn't there? Old bones aren't meant to be so. Fresh. Fresh," Harold repeated, not understanding. The doctor nodded. "Yes. The bones, if they've been here for generations, shouldn't have that much moisture left in them. The salt air, the humidity, it ages bones faster than anything. These should be brittle, but they're not. They're almost new." Harold didn't like the sound of that. "There's something you need to know about this place," Dr. Keene said after a long silence. "Something that might explain why it feels wrong." "I'm listening," Harold said, his voice tight. "Land the lighthouse was built on," Dr. Keene continued, "wasn't just barren rock. It was a burial ground. Long before the lighthouse was erected, there were reports of strange happenings here. Sailors who spoke of ships appearing out of nowhere and the restless souls of the dead. It's not just superstition. It's history. There's an old legend of a man, your ancestor, who built the lighthouse on stolen bones, bones that weren't meant to be disturbed. Harold's blood ran cold. The bones, they were meant to rest, Harold. And when your ancestor built the lighthouse, he desecrated their resting place. That's what's stirring in the tower. The dead are restless, and they want justice. Harold left Dr. Keene's office in a daze. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. His family, his legacy, was built on a lie, on stolen bones, on the desecration of the dead. That night, as the storm raged outside, Harold walked the tower again. The lantern room was a blur of light and shadow, the wind howling against the windows. But something was different now. The bones had grown. They weren't just in the corners anymore. They were moving, slowly, quietly, like a mass of silent hands reaching for him. They scraped against the stone walls, dragging themselves toward the center of the room. Harold stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he heard it. The voices. Help. Us. The air grew cold, and the lantern light flickered violently, casting an eerie glow on the skeletal remains that now surrounded him. The dead were coming. They had been waiting for so long. Suddenly, the door to the lantern chamber slammed shut, trapping Harold inside. The bones around him began to shake, rattling like maracas. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the lantern light grew dimmer, as if something was draining its power. The dead, the restless souls of those buried here, had come to claim what was rightfully theirs. "You desecrated our resting place," a voice hissed from the shadows. It was low, distorted, like it came from the depths of the sea. "Now, you will join us." Harold fell to his knees, the weight of his ancestors' actions crashing down on him. The lantern light flickered one last time before it went out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, and the bones closed in. The last thing Harold saw was the skeletal face of Captain Isaac Bain, his own ancestor, reaching for him from the shadows. The lighthouse groaned. The dead had reclaimed what was theirs. The lighthouse collapsed in on itself with a terrible crash, the bones of the past swallowing it whole. The sea roared in response as if it, too, was a part of the great and terrible reckoning. And from the ruins, nothing remained but the sound of the wind and the waves, forever silent, forever watching. Story number 7. Jude Locke was eager to leave behind his dull life in the city, eager to follow in the footsteps of his father, who had spent years working as a keeper at the old lighthouse on Hawthorne Point, and, most of all, eager to learn what it meant to be a lighthouse keeper, to be part of something timeless, something important. But Hawthorne Point was no ordinary lighthouse, not even close. The place had an air about it that always seemed to be half lost in the fog, as if it were suspended in time. The waves that crashed against the rocks below weren't just waves, they were voices. The wind didn't just whistle through the tower, it carried secrets. And the old keeper, Darren, was something else entirely. He was distant, reserved, his face etched with something that seemed like regret. The man had been working the lighthouse for decades, and the toll it had taken on him was visible in his gaunt, tired eyes. At first, Jude had chalked it up to the isolation, but over the weeks, things started to feel off. There were strange sounds at night, a low hum coming from beneath the tower that seemed to shake the very foundation of the lighthouse. Darren didn't seem to hear it, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. Jude was told to focus on his duties, cleaning the glass, keeping the lantern burning, monitoring the weather. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking beneath the lighthouse, something ancient and alive. It was Elias, the mute handyman, who first pointed it out. He had a way of staring at things with wide, searching eyes, as though trying to convey something that words couldn't express. One evening, when Jude was on his way to the cisterns to fetch some water, Elias grabbed his arm with surprising strength, his eyes full of silent urgency. "Below," Elias mouthed, pointing down into the darkness below the lighthouse. The man's hands trembled, but there was no mistaking the look of fear in his eyes. It was more than just the sea. It was something deeper, something beneath their feet. But Jude, eager to prove himself, had shrugged it off. Elias was just an old man after all, and the idea of something beneath the lighthouse seemed absurd. Yet the more time he spent there, the more he began to wonder. Every time he descended into the cisterns to fetch water, the air grew colder, the walls seemed to close in tighter, as if they were pushing him toward something, toward someone. It wasn't until Darren disappeared that the truth began to sink in. One morning, Jude arrived at the tower to find the keeper's room empty. The bed was undisturbed, the room silent. A note, written in Darren's hand, sat on the desk. It read simply, "He's awake. Don't come down here." Jude's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand. He went down to the cisterns anyway. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended deeper and deeper into the darkness. The air grew thick, wet with the smell of mold and salt. And then he heard it, a soft scraping sound from below, like something dragging itself through the stone. He stopped, a cold chill creeping up his spine, and that's when he saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow, a light far too bright for the darkness of the cisterns. But as he drew closer, the light grew clearer, and with it, the shape of something. Someone. The creature stood at the bottom of the cistern, its body bloated and pale, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. But it was the face that made Jude's breath catch in his throat. It looked like a man's face, but it was wrong. Its features were distorted, its skin thin and stretched, as if it had been submerged in the water for centuries. The eyes were the worst, glowing, flickering like lanterns, illuminating the darkness with an eerie, unnatural light. Jude's legs buckled, but he couldn't look away. The creature's mouth opened, and a sound that was both a growl and a whisper filled the air. "Keeper," it rasped. "New Keeper." Jude's heart raced, and his mind screamed for him to run. But something held him in place. The creature was calling to him, its eyes pulling him forward like a magnetic force. And then, the vision came. Jude saw himself, standing at the lantern room, his face gaunt and pale, eyes hollow like Darren's. He saw himself standing at the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. But it wasn't just a vision of the future. It was him. Jude recoiled, his hand reaching for the stairwell, his mind dizzy with confusion and terror. But the creature's voice was there again, louder this time. "You are the new keeper," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. "You will be the beacon. You will feed me. You will be mine." Jude stumbled back up the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest. He ran through the corridors of the lighthouse, the vision of the creature's face burned into his mind. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He had to get out. But as he reached the top of the tower, the lantern room flickered to life. The light glowed brighter than it had ever been before, casting long shadows across the walls. And then he saw it. Darren's face, pale and gaunt, standing in the corner, eyes glowing like lanterns. "You're here," Darren whispered. His voice was hollow like an echo. "You're the new keeper now." Jude tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. The lantern's light pulsed with an unnatural energy, filling the room with a warmth that made him feel sick. "You're the beacon now," Darren said, his voice distant. "Like all the others before you." Jude realized with a sickening jolt that Darren had never left. He hadn't just disappeared, he had become part of the lighthouse, part of the creature below. The light from the lantern burned brighter, hotter, and Jude felt something inside him shift. His body felt hollow, his mind clouded. The creature was feeding on him, pulling him in. The warmth of the light became suffocating and Jude's vision blurred. And then he understood. He wasn't meant to be the keeper. He was meant to be food. The creature, the keeper below, had lived for centuries, feeding on each new keeper, turning them into a living beacon. A new light to guide the creature's hunger. Jude collapsed, his body shaking, as the lantern light filled him, burning through his veins. The last thing he saw was the glow of the creature's eyes, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The lighthouse stood silent again, its light burning brighter than ever, as the next keeper took their place, hollowed out, glowing and feeding the creature below. The keeper below had claimed its next victim, and the lighthouse would wait, as it always did, for the next soul to arrive. Story number 8. Nora Pike had always loved the lighthouse. The steady rhythm of its beam cutting through the dark, the way it seemed to make the world feel smaller, more contained. It was the kind of place that gave her a sense of purpose, a sense of safety. That's why, when she'd taken the job as keeper of the Blackstone Lighthouse, it had felt right. The lighthouse had been part of her family for generations, ever since her great-grandfather had built it. It was supposed to be her legacy. But lately, something had changed. The new rotating light had been installed only a week ago. The old one, a gas-powered relic from another time, had finally given out. The new light was brighter, faster, more powerful. It should have been an improvement. After all, it was meant to improve visibility, protect ships from crashing into the rocks. But instead, the beam seemed to reveal more than it should. Nora had noticed it one night while checking the lantern. She was standing by the window, the hum of the light filling the room as it slowly rotated. As the beam swept across the ocean, she thought she saw something standing on the cliffside just outside the light's reach. It was only for a second, but it was there. A tall, thin figure, almost human, but not quite. When the beam passed over it again, the figure was gone. At first, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks on her. Maybe it was just the shadows, the way the light bent and twisted in the storm. But over the next few nights, it happened again. The figures, always standing in the same spot, always just outside the light's reach, appeared and disappeared as the beam swept across the dark. She told Dan, the technician who'd helped install the new light. "It's nothing," he'd said, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "Just shadows. The light's messing with your eyes." But Nora couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The figures were too distinct, too deliberate. They didn't look like shadows. They looked like people. But they weren't human. She could feel it. They were something else. It was the night after her sister Margot's birthday that things started to spiral. Margot had been missing for almost 3 years. No one knew what happened to her, not even Nora. The police had searched for months, scouring the cliffs and the beach, but all they found were Margot's personal belongings. Her jacket, a notebook, Nothing else, no sign of her, just gone. That night, Nora was alone in the lighthouse, the beam of the new light cutting through the fog. The wind howled outside, pressing against the glass like it was trying to get in. As the beam rotated, Nora froze. There, in the shadows, was the figure again. But this time, it wasn't just one. There were two, and one of them looked like Margot. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, staring out at the figures. The beam swept around again, and they were gone. The light was supposed to protect. It was supposed to show the way, but instead, it was hiding something. It wasn't revealing what was out there. It was showing her only part of it, the part that the beam could touch. The rest of it, the thing that moved when the light wasn't on it, remained in the shadows. Nora couldn't stand it. She needed to know what was out there. She needed to see the figures for herself, to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. She grabbed the radio, her hands shaking as she called to Dan. "I need you to come up here," she said, her voice tight. "Now." Dan's response came through crackling static. "Nora, what's going on? What's wrong?" "I've seen them. They're out there. I can't explain it, but you need to see them too." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Dan said. But Nora was already turning toward the door, not waiting for him. She climbed up the spiral staircase, feeling her pulse thrum in her ears. When she reached the top, she peered through the window. The figures were there again, standing just outside the reach of the light, watching her. But this time, one of them wasn't just standing still, it was moving, taking steps. Its shape stretching and distorting as it moved in and out of the shadows. Nora's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a trick of the light. These weren't shadows. These were things. Extra-dimensional entities that could only exist in the dark when the beam couldn't touch them. The light rotated again, and the figure vanished, only to reappear when the beam passed away. Nora felt something deep in her gut, a primal terror that told her she was playing with something she didn't understand. But she couldn't stop herself. She was too curious, too driven. "Come on, come on," she muttered to herself as the light rotated again. But when it passed, the figure was closer now, standing right outside the window, its eyes glowing, bright, like lanterns, and it was staring at her. She gasped, stumbling back, her heart racing. The beam swept back over the darkness and the figure disappeared again. That's when she realized something. The light wasn't protecting her from the darkness. It was trapping her in it. It was making her blind to everything else, showing her only what it wanted her to see. The beam rotated again, and this time, something else was waiting in the shadows, a figure standing directly in front of her. She couldn't move. The eyes were glowing, burning like lanterns in the dark. They were staring straight at her. And as the light passed over, Nora felt a coldness rush through her body. The light wasn't keeping them away. It was bringing them closer. The figure reached out, its limbs stretching like smoke, and before she could scream, it was on her, enveloping her in darkness. When Dan arrived at the lighthouse, the light had stopped rotating. The beam was still, the lamp dark. He climbed the stairs to the top, calling for Nora. He found her there, in front of the window, her body limp. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't her eyes anymore. They were glowing, faintly, like lanterns. And when the light began to rotate again, it swept over the darkness. But it didn't reveal what had been out there. It revealed her, Nora, standing still, watching, waiting. The Watchers had claimed her. and the lighthouse stood silent, its light now dark, its watchers still lurking in the shadows. Story number 9. Grant Ellis had never planned on becoming a lighthouse keeper. He'd been a simple man, a man of land, not sea. But after the death of his wife Anne and the crushing weight of his grief, he found himself drawn to the isolation of the lighthouse at Hawthorne Point. The town had a reputation for quiet, a place where he could find solace, or so he thought. When the offer came, become the new keeper, live in the lighthouse far from everything else, he accepted without much hesitation. The sea had a way of soothing him, even though he wasn't sure why. Hawthorne Point Lighthouse was a stark, lonely place, sitting on a cliff overlooking the churning gray waters below. The towering structure stood against the sky like an ancient sentinel, the bell at the top, a massive iron bell, silent most of the time, except for when the storms came. And when they did, the bell tolled. At first, Grant thought it was a normal part of the lighthouse's operation. The bell rung to warn ships of the rocky coastline. But as the storms came more frequently, so did the bell's tolls. Louder, more urgent, and always by itself. The first time it happened, he had been sitting by the fire reading through the keeper's manual when the bell rang out with a force that rattled the windows. Grant stood up quickly, startled, his heart racing. The bell rang again, 3 times in quick succession, and then fell silent. There was no one in the tower. Grant's first thought was that the bell's mechanism had malfunctioned. He climbed the stairs to check, but when he reached the bell chamber, everything was still. The bell sat there, silent, unmoved. What the hell? He muttered to himself, but the question of why the bell had rung stayed with him. It wasn't just the bell that bothered him. The town itself had an odd feel to it. People whispered behind his back when he walked through the market. They gave him strange looks, especially Janine, the town archivist. She had a knowledge of the town's history that seemed too complete. And there was Caleb, the old sailor, who would always cross himself when Grant passed by. Him at the docks. "Stay away from that bell, son," Caleb warned him one evening, his voice rough as he adjusted his weathered coat. "It's cursed. We all know it. The bell doesn't toll for ships. It tolls for something else, and whoever listens doesn't come back." Grant laughed it off. Superstition, he thought. But Caleb's eyes were cold, distant, like a man who had seen too much and didn't want to see any more. After a week of strange nights filled with eerie, unbidden tolls, Grant finally decided to dig deeper. One night, after the bell rang for the 4th time in a storm, he went to Janine's small office in the town hall. She was sorting through dusty old records when he entered, her round glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "You know about the bell," Grant said without preamble. "Tell me what you know." Janine looked up at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. Then she sighed and set down the papers in front of her. "I thought you'd ask eventually," she said quietly. "Most of the town's history has been forgotten, pushed away. But that bell, it's been here a long time, longer than you know." Grant sat down across from her. "What happened?" Janine hesitated, looking down at her hands. "There was a woman, a bell ringer. Her name was Margaret Bellamy. She worked at the lighthouse for decades, long before this one was built. But she wasn't just the bell ringer. She was the keeper's wife." Grant felt a tightening in his chest. "What happened to her?" Janine continued, her voice low. "There was a storm, a bad one. The waves were high and the winds were strong. Margaret tried to warn a ship that was coming in, but the bell wouldn't ring. She had no choice but to go up to the tower herself. She paused, and Grant leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. They say she wasn't supposed to be alone up there, that the tower was meant for men, not women. But she climbed to the top anyway, and when she tried to ring the bell, she slipped. Her body got caught in the ropes, and she was pulled up, until she was strangled by the very bell she'd worked for. Grant felt a chill run down his spine. What happened after? Her body was left there, and the bell, it didn't stop ringing. For days. The town thought it was a warning, but Margaret's body was never found, just gone. And after that, the bell was cursed. Anyone who worked the lighthouse after that, well, they didn't last long. One by one, they all vanished or died. Some say the bell was her last curse, that it's been calling the lost ever since. Grant's head was spinning. What do you mean? Calling them? The bell doesn't just toll to warn ships. It calls them. It calls the dead, and it doesn't stop. Every storm, every night, it's the same. It tolls for them and they answer. And whoever listens, she trailed off, eyes darkening. Whoever listens becomes part of the bell. Grant stood up suddenly. I need to go. He left the office in a daze, his mind reeling. He couldn't just walk away now. He had to know. He had to prove it was just a superstition. But deep down, a part of him knew there was no escaping it. That night, the storm came again, and the bell tolled. It wasn't just the wind, it was the bell, ringing like it had a mind of its own. Grant rushed up the spiral staircase to the bell tower, heart pounding in his chest. When he opened the door, he saw the bell, a dark, hulking mass in the corner of the room. Silent now, but somehow alive with an unnatural energy. And then he heard it, a whisper. Grant. He turned sharply, but no one was there. The sound was coming from the bell itself. Grant, you're next. The bell rang again, louder this time, its tone distorted like a scream. Grant's heart skipped a beat. He tried to move toward the bell, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the bell was pulling him, bending his will, making him a part of its terrible song. He reached out, and as his fingers touched the cold iron, the bell rang one final time, so loud, so deafening, that his ears bled. The town awoke to silence. The next morning, the bell was still, its iron sides rusted and heavy, no longer ringing. Grant Ellis had vanished, and the storm continued to rage as it always did, beneath a sky that had no end. The bell, now silent, still held its echo, and the watchers waited. Story number 10. Damien Cross had always been drawn to the things people told him to stay away from. He called himself an urban explorer, though it wasn't so much the history of forgotten places that fascinated him. It was the thrill, the danger, the sense of walking on the edge of something dark and unexplored. The more forbidden a place, the more it pulled him in. So when he heard about the lighthouse in the bay, the one that had never turned on, he knew he had to see it for himself. The locals in the small town of Carver's Bay were quick to warn him. That tower's cursed. Tara, a local podcast host who'd been interviewing Damien for a project, said with a laugh. No one's ever seen the light come on, and no one's been up there since the keeper vanished decades ago. Damien only smiled. He had heard this kind of talk before. Small towns always had their ghost stories. He wasn't scared. Cursed? Please, he said. I've seen worse. I'm not afraid of some old lighthouse. Tara's face shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing with something like caution. It's not just that. There's something off about it. People don't talk about it much. You'd do well to stay away. But Damien wasn't the type to listen to warnings. He was here for the thrill. So, the next morning, he made his way to the tower, an old, weather-beaten lighthouse perched on a jagged rock just off the shore. The sea around it was rough, waves crashing relentlessly against the base. There was no mistaking the way the place loomed, silent and imposing, like it was daring him to come closer. The tower had stood there for over a century, never shining its light, its bulb dark and untouched. Damien had read the stories, of course, about the keeper who'd vanished, about the families who'd lived nearby and claimed to have heard strange noises at night. But it all sounded like folklore to him, stories to keep people away. As he climbed the steep, winding steps to the top, Damien felt a thrill rush through him. It wasn't fear, it was excitement. The air inside the tower was damp, musty, and smelled of salt and old wood. Every step creaked beneath his weight, and the whole place seemed to groan as if it were alive, resisting him. At the top, the lantern room was completely dark. There was no light, no sign of recent use. Just an empty, hollowed-out space with cracked windows and peeling paint. But there was something else, something Damien didn't expect. In the center of the room, opposite the window, stood a large mirror. It was framed with rusted metal, its surface covered in dust and grime. It was strange to see a mirror in a place like this. Lighthouses didn't need mirrors, didn't need reflections. Curious, Damien stepped closer. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something wrong. The man in the mirror wasn't quite him. He looked a little older, a little more worn, his face twisted in an expression of horror, as though he were seeing something he couldn't comprehend. Damien blinked, stepping back. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, but the man in the mirror didn't move. He was frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with terror. Damien's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about the way his reflection was standing. Like it wasn't just a reflection, it was alive. He reached out slowly, and when his hand touched the glass, he was jolted with a cold, electric shock. The mirror shuddered beneath his touch, and then everything changed. The room around him warped, twisted as if the space itself was folding in on itself. The reflection of the lighthouse in the mirror rippled, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, and for a moment, Damien was sure he wasn't in the same room anymore. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it was filled with something that had been waiting for him. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become a doorway. Then a voice, deep and ancient, whispered through the room. "Come closer." Damien's body froze. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, his hand still pressed against the cold glass. As if drawn by an invisible force, his reflection in the mirror began to change. The man in the mirror, the other Damien, stepped forward, his movements jerky, unnatural, as though the glass was warping time itself. His face twisted into a grin. "No," Damien muttered, stepping back, but it was too late. The other Damien in the mirror reached out, and suddenly, it wasn't just a reflection anymore. The glass shattered like ice, and in the blink of an eye, Damien was pulled through. He stumbled forward, disoriented, and collapsed onto the cold stone floor. When he looked up, he saw a version of the lighthouse that was different, darker, with shadows creeping along the walls in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The air was thick with a salty, suffocating mist. And then he saw it. There, in the corner of the room, was another version of himself, dead. His body was twisted at an impossible angle, eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The longer he looked, the more versions of himself he saw, each one more horrific than the last. Some were drowned, their faces bloated and purple. Others were burned, their skin peeled away. Damien scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his chest. No, this can't be real. But the whispering voice returned, louder now, filling his head with a maddening, ancient sound that made his thoughts crumble. You're here. You've always been here. All the versions of you trapped in the tower. You are a part of me now. The sea god, the one who ruled the water and the depths. It had created this place, a trap for anyone who dared to venture into the tower, a way to feed off their fear and their dying screams. Damien's breath came faster, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to move, to run, but the walls closed in. Every version of himself, every dead version, stared back at him from every corner. They had all been pulled here, trapped in the mirror world, their fears feeding the god who watched over the tower. He turned, desperate to escape, but the exit had vanished. The tower had become a maze, a prison. He was trapped. And then, in a moment of pure terror, the truth hit him. He wasn't just a part of the tower now. He had become part of the reflection itself. As he screamed, his voice echoed. Back at him from every corner, the sound distorted and twisted by the god's influence. His body began to fade, dissolving into the glass, his form becoming one with the countless other versions of himself that had died in this cursed place. When Tara and Marvin arrived the next day, the tower stood silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The bell, once silent, began to toll. But it wasn't a warning. It was a signal. Damien Cross's reflection stared back at them through the cracked mirror, a warning for anyone who dared to enter. The tower had claimed another soul. Think you've seen every horror story out there? Think again. Watch the unlit tower now, if you dare. And remember, when the lights never turned on, it's not because no one's home. It's because something doesn't want to be seen. Like, subscribe, and share this story before the mirror finds you.